that. This has been a superb conference, and I've much enjoyed it so far, and I'm sure the rest of it's going to be great fun as well. I'm not sure about my contribution to it. It's a particular pleasure to be here, I have to say, in the presence both of Lorna Wing and of Gary. Lorna Wing I owe so much to, and it's a pleasure to be able to publicly acknowledge that. So much of what I learned about autism I got from Lorna to begin with, and I suspect that's probably true for many of the people in the room. I was a very early attender at one of Gary's 3-day conferences, and then asked him to come and give some more. And that was hugely insightful. So that's really added to the pleasure of being here. There was a huge amount about outcomes yesterday, which is, of course, the current buzzword, not only in education, but certainly in the health service as well. And one of the most interesting facts I learned was from Kirsten this morning, that there is no word for outcomes in French and German. I think that a little more pondering on the part of the health service and the education service on that particular fact would be useful, because it would make us be very clear about what we're talking about. Outcomes is a splendidly woolly word, but we are forced to look at it at the moment, and there is a current group of which I'm on, which has to produce by the end of June the outcomes for the health service for children and young people, and that will include autism, so the whole of children's services. So it's my intention to ask the NAS to help us, but it's a bit of a tall order. Anyway, today what I'm talking about is the NICE guidelines. And NICE is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. It's important to remember that it lays an onus on the health service. It's a health service guidelines. That's what they're produced for. And yet we know that children and young people spend an enormous amount of their time in the education service. But NICE does not speak to the education department. It speaks to the health service, and for some of its guidelines for social care as well. So it's been it's one of the difficulties that we've faced in writing the NICE guidelines is how you write something which you hope very much education will find useful and will be used in education, but that's not what the National Institute of Clinical Excellence actually speaks to. I'm going to talk today about the guideline for children and young people from 0 to 19 years for recognition, referral and diagnosis. So rather than outcomes and woolliness, we're right back at the beginning, recognition, referral and diagnosis. And this was the first guideline that NICE set up. I've also included in the talk some of the content from the adult guideline as well, but that's still in consultation, so it's not final. So NICE is producing 3 guidelines, and the first one was in recognition, referral and diagnosis. And that, for many of us sitting on it, was a sort of frustration, because what's the point of diagnosis if you can't do something about it? But I'm very glad to say that NICE has now set up a second children's guideline, which we've just started, which is going to be on management and support for children and young people with autism and their families. And there's an adult guideline, which is recognition, referral, diagnosis, management and support of adults. And that is, as I say, just completed its consultation phase and will be out in June. So the reason why the process started, and there is a very specific process about the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which one also has to understand in the product, that the Department for Health say, these are some of the topics we want a guideline on. They tell NICE that this is what they're going to do. NICE process then goes into operation. They have a scope, decide what they're going to cover, set some questions, look at evidence, very much along the lines that Michelle was outlining yesterday, I'm glad to say, and then produce a guideline. But they also have a guideline development group. And the purpose of that group, it's drawn from a number of professionals, but also users of the service. Where there is no evidence, then an opinion based on the guideline development group is allowed. And I have to say that in autism, it is not quite an evidence-free zone, but the amount of evidence of the quality standard that Michelle was setting yesterday is really very low. The reason for the guideline then was because of the variation in diagnostic services. The fact that there were many reported delays in parents being able to get a diagnosis, which is seen still as really the access to services, that until you have the diagnosis, you can't access the appropriate services. And because of the inequalities which we were asked to address, that diagnosis is less often made if you've got an associated intellectual disability, that there's some evidence that girls may not receive a diagnosis, that those where there is dual language, that children who are looked after are a particularly challenging group for diagnosis, and those in the criminal justice system, which we were hearing yesterday, there's probably an overrepresentation, but an under-access to appropriate diagnosis. So those were the reasons for the guideline. Before going into the details of what we found and what we concluded, I want just to set the context, because things like this don't really happen in a vacuum, and this has been a really rather rapidly changing scenario. Some years ago, Anna Couture and I, with the help of the National Autistic Society, wrote the National Autism Plan, which was influential at the time and I think did change a lot of people's services. The Americans have also produced guidelines, one just before the National Autism Plan and then one very recently. There are New Zealand guidelines. Scotland has an excellent guideline, the SIGN guideline. And then, of course, we've had the bill, the autism bill, which followed by the autism strategy, published in 2010. Which laid a statutory legal duty that for adults there had to be a certain series of services for recognition, referral and diagnosis, and then with a care plan. And we certainly thought that there should be no less for children and young people. So those are all the features of the national context which it was important to have in mind. I want to say something too about prevalence, because that too has changed in terms of the number of reported prevalence rates, which has a huge impact on health service resources and the number of people coming for diagnosis. A little bit about the DSM and then these other headings as well. Well, the prevalence of autism, I think probably when Lorna first became interested in it, was thought to be about 4 per 10,000 was the figure that was used. And then, of course, there were her own studies which expanded that. And then most recently, prevalence studies have been talking about at least 1% of children with an autism spectrum disorder. And that's an underestimate, I suspect. Our own prevalence study did not cover children who had a normal range of intelligence, necessarily the full gamut. So it's at least 1% of children have an autism spectrum disorder. It's helpful to bear in mind that prevalence studies vary by a huge amount in the prevalence rates that they're quoting, but it's certainly a very much larger number than was originally thought. And there may well be a number of children with similar symptoms, but what it means for a service is that you're quite likely, if you're running a service for under 5s, to receive referrals about 3, 4, 5% of children, certainly 3% from many of my colleagues saying, has this child got autism? Now that's a very large number of children that you're having to provide some sort of service for. And of course, nobody really quite knows why. Perhaps there's been a broadening of diagnostic categorization. I think there most certainly has. We certainly include children now who have other diagnoses who might not in the past have got a diagnosis of autism as well. The whole thrust of many of the classification systems was that you had one disorder, but you didn't have more than one. So that has all, I think, had a considerable influence on the prevalence rates. But this is still a disorder for which there is no biomarker. There isn't a diagnostic test which you can just apply and say yes or no, despite the hype over some of the recent scanning studies or even EEG studies. There is still no biomarker. This is still a disorder defined by its behaviours. The surface features, which I'm sure are representations of an underlying cognitive style, but we don't have the ways of getting at that, so we depend upon surface features. Another important feature of autism is that its manifestations will vary hugely with the age at which you are meeting that child or young person. And that's a challenge for diagnosis. So no biomarker, huge variation in manifestation, different at different ages, all challenges. And those of us that are practicing in the health services and in medicine have tended to use the classification systems which try to set criteria for diagnosis so that what you might call a disorder in one country will be the same as another country, will be the same as that group working down the road. So we have these diagnostic systems. ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases, and it's written and set up by the World Health Organization. Now, it provides a narrative description of particular disorders. There is also a research category, but a research version, but it is essentially a narrative description of the kinds of problems that you find. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals, the American version, sets very clear criteria and has tended to be used the world over in research studies. And both of these classifications are changing currently and are likely to be changed by 2013. And they have made very substantial changes to the criteria, particularly for autism spectrum disorders. For a start, the whole title has changed. Instead of pervasive developmental disorder, which is the current term used in both of those classification systems, autism spectrum disorder will be the term used in both. There's the removal of the subgroups of the autism spectrum disorders because they are used so variably by different groups in different places, and there isn't a good basis for the subgroups anyway. Rett syndrome, which was part of the pervasive developmental disorders group, is being removed. There's a reduction in domains so that instead of the traditional, what was the traditional 3 domains of social, communication, and then the restricted repetitive behaviors and interests, there will be 2, because it's when you're thinking about social communication and social interaction, the reciprocity, the two-way nature of that social interaction and social communication, it's quite difficult to split it into what was social interaction and what's social communication. So they are being combined. So there will be 2 domains rather than 3. And coexistence with other diagnoses will be allowed, and there will be severity specifiers. There's been a considerable amount of controversy about all of this, but both classification systems will be trying to harmonize in those changes. When I was first became interested in the whole topic of autism, it was very clearly, I was attending Mike Rutter's clinics, and it was very clear that you either had autism or you didn't. That is no longer the situation, and we now think in terms of dimensions for social and communicative reciprocity. But we have to, at some point, decide on a categorical diagnosis. You either have or do not have a disorder. But we are dealing with dimensions, and that has been, I think, one of the major changes and recognitions. And I find that some work by John Constantino, in which he was looking for how would you measure the skill of social responsiveness in a whole population, where you would be looking at strengths as well as deficits in that area. And he has a social communication score, which you may well be familiar with. But what this illustrates is that there is perhaps hidden in here a normal distribution pattern with another loop. But what's perfectly clear is that it's very difficult to see where you would move on the right-hand side of the screen from having a problem to no problem. It seems to grade into the extreme. On the right-hand side, you would have people who had considerable difficulty with social responsiveness and who would be in the autism spectrum. But there is no clear cutoff, and that, I think, is one of the major challenges in diagnosis today. The different coloured bars represent male and female, that the males have perhaps rather more of the difficulties towards the right-hand side and the way that they're measured on that particular screen. So a problem of dimensions when what we're trying to deal with is, have you got a problem or haven't you? So it's on that background that we were then set up to look at and produce guidelines for the recognition, referral, and diagnosis. Our aims in doing that was to try to make a difference and to make practical recommendations insofar as we were able for frontline staff. What should the health service do and what should the health service be providing? But it's important that we were also wish to look and support person-centred care, and in particular to try and promote a way of coordinating the diagnostic approach. Whether or not we've been successful, I will leave you to judge. But we did consult first with the help of the National Autistic Society, with parents and what did they want. And parents are absolutely clear. They had no doubt about what they wanted. They wanted a clear pathway. They wanted to know where to go, what was the pathway to get there. They wanted to have decreased waiting times. They did not want to wait for 18 months or 2 years for a diagnosis before they would actually be able to access services. They wanted to see people who knew about the condition. They wanted a specialist service. They wanted those people that they were seeing to be aware about all the coexisting difficulties that the child or young person might have, and to be able to define and elucidate those in a way that would actually help them, but with an emphasis on the uniqueness of each child's presentation. So very clear messages. And, of course, they wanted an improved coordinated approach to diagnosis rather than the separation that they had personally experienced, and to make diagnosis much more collaborative with them and, where appropriate, to their child or adolescent. And provide proper support before, during, and after diagnosis. Because much of the diagnosis is done within the child health services, we asked community paediatricians what their views were, and were asked, for goodness sake, don't produce a completely unworkable guideline. Tell us that we've got to use tools which are going to take us many, many hours, and so on, bearing in mind that we may have to see perhaps 3 or 4% of the population referred. Query, is this an autism disorder? We were asked to clarify some terminology, and most particularly to try and give some guidance about differential diagnosis for the most difficult group, for example, those that looked after children to whom I've referred, and whether or not the children had an attachment disorder or whether it was an autism spectrum disorder, very difficult. And what about quasi-autism, a term coined by Professor Rutter to describe children who had extremely adverse experiences in the Romanian orphanages. And also to clarify what tests should be done, what should the health service offer, what was the evidence. As a guideline development group, we made some early decisions. And the first was about terminology. There were, again, very widespread views on the matter of terminology. Many adults who have some autism do not see themselves as having a disorder and would prefer to talk about a condition. And yet the international classification systems are quite clear. They're talking about a disorder. There are many other terms that one could use. But what the decision which across NICE has been taken is that we will use the term autism. And autism covers all of the autism spectrum conditions and disorders, and it's the term used by recent Department of Health and the National Audit Office as well. So that's the term that we've used, that we would have regard to the new classification systems, but because the guideline was coming out last year, that we would use the DSM-4 and the ICD-10 as the criteria for diagnosis. And importantly, we decided as a group that we would conceptualize the process of diagnostic assessment in a very broad way. Not that it was just a matter of saying yes or no, so not just applying a label, but really considering what the strengths and weaknesses of the child, young person were within their family. A systematic look for coexisting conditions, a full examination of the differential diagnosis with this whole purpose that you would then be able to produce a profile of the child's needs within the context of their family, covering all of those issues. So that was how we conceptualized the process of diagnostic assessment. Now, NICE then has this very precise way of continuing its process, sets the questions, looks for the evidence, the evidence is produced. There either is good quality evidence or there isn't. If there isn't good quality evidence, the guideline development group can express an opinion, it makes recommendations, the whole thing then goes to a vast group of stakeholders, they can then make comments, the guideline is then changed as a result of the stakeholder comments, and then it's published. So that's the process. We started with some key questions, which is what you have to do in NICE. So what were the signs and symptoms that you should look for? What's core to autism diagnosis? What tools should you use for diagnosis? What's the evidence base for using particular tools? What's the evidence base for using any particular screening tools? What biomedical investigations would inform a diagnosis of autism? Which are the coexisting conditions you should systematically look for? And what information and support should be available? So now then to come to our recommendations. And those recommendations start as follows, but particularly start with structural aspects. That every district or area, this was another bit of terminology we had great fun with, currently in the health service there isn't any way of referring to a locality or a group or an area or whatever. There just isn't a word any longer. So we were used to you talking about localities. Every locality, the idea it should be local, would have a strategy group. The strategy group would be broadly inclusive. So commissioners, managers, user groups, child health, mental health, primary care, secondary care, voluntary sector. That group would be responsible for appointing a lead professional for autism for the locality and for developing a pathway, a clear pathway of referral. And we suggested that there should be a single point of entry, so it's very clear to all in education, health and social care, what was the mechanism of direction if you had a concern that somebody might have autism. So you developed a pathway, that there should be multi-professional training to raise awareness of autism across everybody who would be involved, and that would include education and social care, that there would be regular audit of how that process was working, and an onus for data collection, how many children had an autism spectrum disorder. So following very much what was had been suggested in by the Adult Autism Bill and then the Autism Strategy. So structural features first. That there should be a specialist team with specialist competencies in autism. Now, those members of that team could well be members of many other teams, but they had to have specific autism competence and training in the diagnosis of autism. And we specified a core membership, which would be including a medic, either pediatric, child health trained or psychiatry, speech and language therapist, psychologist, from clinical or education or both, and a number of other desirable members. But the emphasis is on competence in autism. For recognition, the planks were really about awareness training and an emphasis on multi-agency awareness training so that everybody in a locality is trained using the same tools, having the same ideas, knowing what the pathway is and so on. We produced in the guideline a table of signs and symptoms, but they're not intended to be a checklist. It was all too easy to produce yet another checklist. They're not intended for that. They are intended to be exactly what they say, which is signs and symptoms of the core features of the autism spectrum disorder. They do include sensory hyper and hyposensitivities, which are now part of the new DSM, but are not in the current DSM. But clear to many of us that they're such an important feature that they are part of that signs and symptoms and will be part of the new DSM. NICE doesn't consider primary population screening. That's not its role. There's a national screening committee that does that. And that National Screening Committee has currently concluded, again, that there is no basis for total population screening for autism. There aren't good enough tools. The evidence for intervention and changed outcomes is not good enough either. So that's a contrast to the United States. But primary population screening was not what we were considering. We did consider secondary screening. So let's say you have a group of children where you're concerned about some aspect of their development. Should you then use a screening tool? What's the evidence for using a screening tool such as the SCQ, Social Communication Questionnaire, and a variety of others? When we looked at the evidence, it's not good enough to be able to recommend that that should be routinely used as your basis for deciding whether you should have an autism diagnostic assessment. Because you can screen positive for that for reasons that are not autism, and you can have autism and still screen negative. So you need to have a wider consideration rather than relying on a screening tool. Regression is a common feature of young children with autism. The loss of skills in the second year of life happens in perhaps up to a third, but somewhere between 20 and 30%. The papers vary in that. That is very often a sort of red flag. It's an indicator that autism is quite a possible diagnosis. And we recommended that for children under 3, where there was a regression in language and social skills, that should be flagged up as a recommendation that they should proceed to an autism-specific assessment. If the child, however, regresses in physical attributes, or so, for example, they can't walk or whatever, that's much less likely to be an autistic presentation. Obviously, the referral should follow a neurological route. And for children over 3, where epilepsy is a possible underlying cause, again, you should seek the advice of a neurologist first, who can then refer on. In other situations, we were asked to consider exact criteria for referral, and I've mentioned the fact that screening tools, there's inadequate evidence. And really what we're asking is that people use clinical judgment, but that it's trained clinical judgment, and that's where you're relying on the multi-professional training. So you can have issues of pervasiveness, severity, particularly where parents are concerned, then you have to take that very seriously indeed and for your referral. And also, of course, there are risk factors. That if you have another child with autism, much higher likelihood, and you already suspect, then that should be a reason for referral. That there may well be conditions such as tuberous sclerosis, neurofibromatosis, those are medical conditions with a higher than greater risk of autism, prematurity, a known risk, and so on. So for risks, you would refer earlier. The adult guideline follows a similar route in that there are, for identification, there are the usual features of persistent social difficulties, but also others, problems in maintaining employment, sustaining relationships, which might be reasons for flagging up in your mind the possibility of autism here. So that is going to be in the adult guideline. And they too then looked at, well, what were the criteria for referral? And again, followed very much along the lines that it is the specificity of these particular symptoms which should suggest that what you need is a definite referral for a full assessment. Is this autism? They've also used Simon Baron-Cohen's most recent work on the AQ10 and have suggested that for those with average and above average ability, then a score of greater than 6 on the AQ10 could be a reason for referral. I think that's work that needs replication, but they have felt able to give a particular reference to a particular screening tool, which we did not in the child guideline feel we had the evidence for. So all the features that will be very familiar to you there. The adult guideline too has emphasized the competence and training of the autism team. And also that it should be team-based, so that you're drawing on multiple skills that different people can bring to that. And of course, as we will emphasize in the child guideline too, you need an informant, if at all possible, so that you can get a developmental history, although that clearly is a challenge on some occasions in the adult guideline. We were very conscious of the need that parents had brought up for support during this whole process. And one of our recommendations is that there should be a case coordinator appointed from within the team for all those going through an autism assessment, so that would be somebody who would be with the family pre, during, and post-diagnosis. So a case coordinator. When it comes to the assessment itself, the key points that I want to pick out from the list that you might expect are that you must take a history which is focused on the kind of difficulties that the parents are concerned about or other people are concerned about. So what's the problem? Systematically go through a history asking about the features of autism that might be manifest. And you have to see the child or young person. That may sound obvious, but it doesn't always happen. So seeing and hearing, both extremely important. You need a medical history about possible risk factors. We looked for evidence that we would be able to recommend particular tools to guide the history taking about autism. There is insufficient evidence to recommend any particular tool. In fact, there is a paucity of evidence about many of the tools which are widely used. So we didn't make a recommendation. What we did about a particular tool, what we have said is that it's very useful to be trained on a tool. It's useful to have a tool at your disposal, that you don't always have to follow it, as long as you are using a structured history to take details of the kinds of behaviours which would be key if you were working towards making a diagnosis of autism. And the same is true when you observe the child, that you are systematically looking for those features. The best evidence for observation is for children under 5 using the Autism Diagnostic Observational Schedule. There is evidence that that is useful. Nevertheless, as we all know from personal experience, you can have children who look as though they're quite unusual when you use that particular tool. If you use it in a very structured way, so there are other reasons why you might have difficulties using it, for the child who might have difficulty using it, and you may find that you've made a diagnosis of autism, whereas actually all the rest of your evidence doesn't support that. And then you must put together these two pieces of information to make your diagnosis, and that diagnosis remains a clinical one. It is best estimate clinical diagnosis using tools. You consider the differential diagnosis. A physical examination should be performed on all young people in whom you come to a conclusion that they have an autistic diagnosis. This has again caused some difficulties because that doesn't happen in many cases, and indeed many adolescents would perhaps not be expected to undergo a physical examination themselves, but everybody had examples of something like neurofibromatosis being missed. But there are no routine medical tests that we're recommending which would help. Genetic tests as advised by your local services, and of course you have to use clinical judgment as a doctor in what other tests you might find useful. We have recommended that a systematic examination of coexisting conditions should be undertaken and communication of findings. Essentially, you have this assessment to provide a profile. And that's the profile which you should be able to develop on every child, which would then be used to form a management plan for various interventions covering a wide range of skills, strengths and weaknesses in the context of the family needs and also the educational needs. So that would include the way in which the child was able to use their skills, so-called adaptive behaviour, the barriers to engagement because of sensory sensitivities, and so on. The adult guideline, also much more clearly, we have mentioned a risk assessment, but very clearly sets out that every assessment too should anticipate possible problems, should anticipate the situations which are going to give rise to difficulties, and look specifically at whether the child or whether the adult in this case, but it applies also to the child or young person, is at risk from harm to themselves, harm by others, vulnerabilities, and so on, and should make specific plans so that you've got a plan of what you're going to do in anticipation of this kind of difficulty. So a risk assessment followed by a plan. Following assessment, immediate feedback to families of what you've been doing, why you've come to the conclusions you have, and another specific recommendation that there should be a follow-up discussion with the families 6 weeks after the assessment's been completed, when a written report will have been delivered, so that you can go over the findings with families, and that with permission, that report is then disseminated. We were very keen to try to put in the necessity for a school visit by the assessment team so that the findings could be translated immediately into education. That was difficult because of the problems I've mentioned, that NICE cannot impose recommendations which would be conducted in other departments' education, but nevertheless we very much hope that that will be read into the report. So those are the main recommendations that we've come up with, which we hope will make a difference to the services which are available for children and young people and their families with regard to recognition, referral and diagnosis. NICE also has an obligation to look at potential costs and the economics of it. Again, very difficult because of the lack of evidence. But the potential areas for cost are in the recruitment and training, the increase in overall volume of referrals, although I think for many of my colleagues, the peak has already been reached and it's kind of plateauing now. So they've ridden through that and had to develop skills among their teams to meet that demand. And possibly some increased costs because of our suggestion that there should be full discussion with the environment in which the child is spending much of their time, i.e. school, as well as further discussions with the family. So there's a potential area for costs. Difficult to find potential area for savings in a time when there's great economic difficulties. But what we hope, and of course we've got a green paper as well from the Department for Education here, which is putting forward a strong view that there should be a joint health, education and social care assessment for children, that if this was truly joint, rather than serial assessments by different people, then this is an area, I think, for potential savings. And I'm, again, just sorry that our guideline is for one group only, when really what we're trying to do in every conceivable way is to improve the integration both at every level, at recognition level, at referral level, particularly at diagnostic and assessment level, and then, of course, subsequently as well. So I think there could be potential savings, but that's what we're hoping. So what's needed to effect change? Well, it's leadership. Leadership, somebody that really wants to take hold of this at national, regional and local levels. The strategy group, commissioners commissioning for a full pathway, that lovely word outcomes, clinicians and managers working together, and I suspect in the health service, a tariff actually tied to what we're doing, because that's the most often the most powerful way is if you get paid for a particular process, then that makes a difference. So there are a couple of further slides, which is really to say that there's a nice pathway, which is all available, downloadable from on the NICE website, very accessible indeed, which covers all of this, and that there's also an NHS evidence site where all the evidence for this is produced as well. Thank you.